Ethan Walker was just 11 when he walked into the snowy auction barn, clutching a rusty coffee tin filled with his savings. He wasn't looking for treasure, only hope. But the moment the hammer fell and the trembling German Shepherd was handed to him, everything changed. When Ethan's father, Sheriff Mason Walker, saw the worn metal tag beneath the dog's collar, his heart stopped. It belonged to his fallen partner, Officer Mark Davis. The same K-9 that had vanished the night Mark died in a warehouse explosion 3 years ago. What happened next would uncover a secret buried in snow and fire, heal a family's grief, and prove that some heroes never truly leave us. What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow fell heavy over Silver Ridge, Montana, blanketing the quiet mountain town beneath a veil of white. Wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling signs and bending the bare pines that lined the old Silver Ridge fairgrounds. Inside the barn, the storm's roar was softened to a low hum. Golden light flickered from hanging lamps, warming the air thick with hay dust and damp wool. Tonight's auction was meant to raise funds for the county's struggling animal shelter, a tradition as old as the town itself. But this year, the faces were fewer, the wallets thinner, and the mood subdued by both weather and hard times. At the far back of the barn, standing on tiptoe among adults in thick coats, was Ethan Walker, an 11-year-old boy with wind-reddened cheeks and gray eyes too serious for his age. His brown hair stuck out from beneath a knit beanie, and his gloves were worn thin at the fingertips. In his hands, he held a rusted coffee tin, its faded blue paint chipped away. Inside, a small fortune of coins and crumpled bills he had earned by shoveling snow and mowing lawns all summer. The auctioneer's voice boomed through a portable speaker. Lot number 27, male German Shepherd, roughly 5 years old, failed the K-9 program, returned twice, possibly sick. Starting bid, $50. He was a burly man named Tom Reeves, late 50s, shoulders broad as a barn door, his face lined from years of ranch work. His cowboy hat cast a long shadow over his eyes as he scanned the crowd. No one raised a hand. He cleared his throat, irritation creeping into his voice. Anyone. He's a fine breed, just needs a firm hand. No response. Only the shifting of boots and the occasional cough. The German Shepherd sat at the farthest cage, pressed into a corner. His ribs were visible beneath his dull coat, one ear half bent, the other upright. His nose twitched, his gaze distant, unfocused. The creature looked like he had long ago stopped expecting kindness. A whisper ran through the crowd. Someone muttered, "That one's no good. They said he bit a handler." Another replied, "Better to put him down than waste feed." Ethan swallowed hard, his small fingers tightening around the coffee tin. Then he took a deep breath and lifted his hand. "I'll take him." The words came out higher and smaller than he intended, but they cut through the murmurs like a bell. Tom Reeves blinked. "You'll what, son?" "I'll buy him," Ethan said, louder this time. His voice shook, but his chin didn't. A few heads turned. Laughter rippled faintly through the room. Reeves leaned forward over the podium, squinting. "You got $50? "Yes, sir," Ethan said, stepping closer. He set the coffee tin on the table and unscrewed the lid. Coins clattered and rolled, catching the light as he counted. "I've been saving since summer." A pause fell. Even the storm outside seemed to quiet. Reeves rubbed his jaw, half amused, half uncertain. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "All right, then." Sold to the boy in the back. The gavel struck the block with a sharp crack. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. The world seemed to blur. The smell of straw, the low hum of voices, the frost of his breath. He had done it. Tom Reeves nodded toward the pen. "He's all yours, kid. Be careful with him, though. That dog's got a story behind those eyes." Ethan walked toward the cage slowly. The German Shepherd didn't move. His body trembled slightly, his gaze wary but not aggressive. The boy crouched and whispered softly, "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now." The dog's nose twitched. After a long pause, he leaned forward, sniffing the boy's mitten. Ethan smiled faintly, the corners of his lips trembling with relief. At the back of the barn, an older man watched in silence. Jim Holloway, a retired police officer in his late 60s, stood leaning on his cane near the door. His hair was white and unkempt beneath a worn brown hat, and his heavy coat looked older than the boy's father. His blue eyes, still sharp despite age, followed every movement in the pen. When Ethan led the shepherd out, wrapped in his old coat to keep it from shivering, Holloway's frown deepened. "Boy," he called, his voice rough from years of shouting over sirens and storms. Ethan stopped, startled. "What's his name?" "I don't know," Ethan said softly. "They didn't say." Holloway's gaze lingered on the animal. The shepherd's walk was uneven, his head slightly tilted to one side as if listening for something long gone. "You take care of that one," the old man said finally. His tone was calm, but the weight behind his words made Ethan look up. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, though he didn't quite understand. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Some dogs," he murmured, eyes still fixed on the shepherd, "don't just carry scars. They carry ghosts." The boy hesitated, sensing the chill in the man's voice. Then he nodded. "I'll be careful." The old officer gave a short nod and turned away, the sound of his cane tapping against the wooden floor fading beneath the howl of the wind. Ethan looked back at the dog beside him. The creature's amber eyes flickered up, uncertain but trusting for the first time. The boy smiled gently. Outside, the storm raged on, but for the first time that night, the cold didn't seem quite so sharp. The blizzard had not stopped since afternoon, and by nightfall Silver Ridge looked like a ghost town drowned in white. The streets were empty, the lampposts buried in snow, and the sound of the wind moaned like an old memory across the valley. In the faint orange glow of the porch light, a small figure trudged through the storm. Ethan Walker, his scarf half frozen, one hand gripping a leash made from an old rope. At the other end, stumbling weakly through the drifts, was a German shepherd with ribs showing beneath a dull coat. Ethan's breath came in clouds as he struggled up the porch steps, boots slipping on the icy wood. "Come on, boy," he whispered, coaxing softly. "Just a little more. You're safe now." The dog hesitated, his paws raw from the cold. He looked up at the boy, unsure whether to trust him, then took one careful step after another until they both reached the door. Ethan pushed it open, the hinges groaning, and led the animal inside. Warm air hit them. A small fire burned in the living room stove, its glow flickering over the framed photos on the mantel. The house smelled faintly of pine and old coffee. Ethan hurried to find a towel, drying the dog's fur as best as he could. The creature shivered violently, but didn't resist. "You're okay now," Ethan murmured, wrapping his own coat around the dog. "I'll get you some water." The front door slammed open. The sound made both Ethan and the dog jump. Standing in the doorway, snow still clinging to his Navy patrol jacket, was Sheriff Mason Walker, a tall man of 38 with short dark hair streaked with silver and eyes the color of a winter storm. His face was red from the cold and long hours outside. He had just come off a double shift patrolling the highways for stranded motorists. He froze at the sight before him. His son crouched on the floor, cradling a half-starved shepherd in the middle of the living room rug. "What on earth is that?" Mason's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Ethan turned quickly, his heart pounding. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. It looks like you dragged a stray animal into my house." Mason dropped his gloves on the table, his tone sharp. "Explain. Now." Ethan swallowed hard. I bought him." Mason blinked. "You what?" "From the auction at the fairgrounds," Ethan said quickly. "They were going to put him down. Nobody wanted him, so I used my savings. He's just scared. Not bad." Mason's jaw tightened. "You used your savings? Ethan, you're 11. You can't just bring home a sick dog like—" He gestured toward the shepherd, whose head now hung low, tail tucked between his legs. "He's not sick," Ethan protested. "He's just cold and hungry." Mason exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You don't even know where that thing came from. It could have fleas, infections." "He's not a thing!" The boy's voice rose, trembling. "He's alive. He just needs someone to care about him." For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the hiss of the fire and the faint whimper of the dog. Mason's anger flickered, replaced by something heavier. Fatigue, grief, a memory that still haunted him. He looked again at the shepherd, at the scars along its muzzle and the tired intelligence in its eyes. "Ethan," he said finally, his voice lower, "move back." The boy hesitated, then obeyed. Mason knelt beside the animal, inspecting it carefully. "Hold still, boy," he muttered. The dog didn't growl or snap, only watched him, trembling. Mason reached under the neck and found a worn leather collar, its buckle stiff with rust. Hanging from it was a small metal tag, half hidden beneath matted fur. He turned it over, squinting at the faint engraving. His breath caught. K9 Unit, number 092, Officer M. Davis. The room seemed to fall silent. The fire crackled softly behind them. Ethan frowned. "What's wrong, Dad?" Mason didn't answer at first. He stared at the tag as though it were something out of a dream. "M. Davis," he murmured, almost to himself. "Mark Davis." "Who's Mark Davis?" Mason stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "He was my partner," he said quietly. "Your godfather." Ethan blinked. "The one who—" "Yes." Mason's voice dropped to a whisper. "The one who died." He sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him. 3 years ago, there had been a warehouse explosion at the edge of town. He and Mark had been investigating an arms smuggling ring when everything went wrong. Mason had made it out. Mark hadn't. The fire, the smoke, the chaos, and the last sound he'd heard before blacking out was barking. Desperate, panicked barking. He looked at the shepherd again, realization dawning. "That's Duke," he said softly. "Mark's canine partner. We thought he died in the blast." Ethan's eyes widened. "You mean, he's a police dog?" Mason nodded slowly, still dazed. "He was. One of the best." They both looked at the animal, now lying quietly by the fire, eyes half closed, but ears flicking at the sound of his name. "Duke," Ethan whispered experimentally. The dog stirred, tail thumping weakly against the rug. The reaction made both father and son freeze. Mason let out a long breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, I'll be damned." He walked to the mantel and picked up an old photo frame coated in dust. In it, a younger Mason and Mark stood side by side in their uniforms, smiling, with Duke between them, alert and proud. Mason brushed a finger over the glass. The dust smeared away, revealing the faint reflection of his own face beside the two men. Ethan stepped closer. "You still miss him, don't you?" Mason didn't look up. "Every day." Silence filled the room again. The storm had softened. Outside, flakes drifting gently past the window. Mason turned toward the boy and sighed. "All right," he said finally. "He stays, for now, but he sleeps in the mudroom until I figure out what condition he's in. You'll help me take care of him, and you'll do it properly. Understood?" Ethan nodded quickly, his face lighting up. "Yes, sir, I will." Mason tried to sound stern, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him with a faint smile. "Go on, then. Feed him something warm. Just a little. Not too much." The boy rushed off to the kitchen. Mason lingered by the fire, staring at the photo again. Duke's image seemed almost alive in the frame, his amber eyes shining with the same light as they did now by the hearth. When Ethan returned with a bowl of broth, Mason took the old picture from the mantel and wiped it clean. Then he set it back upright, no longer face down as it had been for years. He glanced at the sleeping shepherd and whispered under his breath, "Welcome home, partner." The dog shifted, letting out a deep sigh, as if he'd heard and understood. Outside, the wind began to fade, leaving only the soft hush of falling snow. And inside the Walker home, warmth began to return, not just from the fire but from something far older and harder to name, the beginning of healing. Morning came cold and gray over Silver Ridge, the snow still thick across the fields. The world seemed hushed after the storm, but inside the Walker farmhouse the silence had a different weight, the kind that comes from worry. In the mudroom, Duke lay on a folded blanket. He hadn't moved much since the night before. His head rested on his paws, eyes half open, not sleeping, but not awake either. The bowl of food Ethan had placed near him remained untouched, and when the boy nudged it closer, Duke only turned his head away. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, bundled in his flannel pajamas and an oversized hoodie. "You've got to eat something, buddy," he whispered. "Please." The dog didn't respond. His breathing was shallow and his gaze distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world only he could see. When a police cruiser passed by outside, its distant siren wailing faintly through the morning air, Duke's entire body stiffened. His ears flattened, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Ethan froze, afraid even to breathe. The sound of the siren faded, but Duke's trembling didn't stop. Ethan slowly reached out and laid a gentle hand on the dog's shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured. "No one's going to hurt you." From the kitchen doorway, Sheriff Mason Walker stood watching quietly. He was dressed in his winter patrol uniform, jacket zipped, badge gleaming faintly in the light from the window. His expression softened for just a second as he looked at his son and the broken animal beside him. Then he cleared his throat. "Ethan, finish your breakfast. You'll be late for school." Ethan looked up, reluctant. "He's not eating, Dad." "I see that." Mason stepped closer, crouching down beside them. He studied the dog's body language. The stiffness, the averted eyes, the twitch in his muscles. "He's showing signs of trauma. Classic PTSD response. Noise triggers, withdrawal." "Like soldiers get?" Ethan asked. Mason nodded. "Exactly like that. Mark used to tell me Duke hated fireworks, but this?" He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "This is worse." He stood and walked toward the counter, where his thermos waited beside a small pile of case files. "You can try giving him boiled chicken later," he said. "Keep the noise down around him." Ethan nodded, but didn't move. His gaze followed Duke's every breath. When Mason left for work, the house fell silent again, except for the crackle of the wood stove. Ethan sat beside Duke for another hour, flipping through an old notebook. The cover was worn, the pages filled with neat handwriting, his father's. Across the top, in faded ink, read, "Training Manual, for Ethan, age 8. He remembered the day Mason had given it to him. Back then, Duke was still with Mark. Ethan had loved watching them train. The way Duke sprinted at every command, eyes bright, tail wagging. The dog had been fearless, unstoppable. Now that same animal lay broken in his home, flinching at shadows. Ethan traced one of the notes with his finger. "Patience is more powerful than command." He looked down at Duke. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. That afternoon, after school, Ethan returned home and set up a small camera on a tripod by the mudroom door. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old camcorder Mason had once used to record family camping trips. The battery was weak, but it worked. "I'm just trying to help you, okay?" Ethan said as he positioned it. "If I can understand what scares you, maybe I can fix it." The dog blinked once, uninterested, but didn't move. Ethan turned on the recording light and went about his chores quietly. Later that evening, Mason returned home, snow dusting his shoulders. He was exhausted, the weight of paperwork and patrol still clinging to him. "You recording a movie in there?" he asked dryly when he saw the camera blinking red. Ethan looked up from his homework. "Kind of. I'm trying to figure out what Duke does when we're not here." Mason smirked faintly but didn't comment. "Dinner in 10 minutes, he said, heading toward the kitchen. After dinner, Ethan replayed the footage on his laptop. For the first few minutes, Duke barely moved. Then, around midnight, something changed. A distant sound. The hum of a passing snowplow made the dog lift his head. He stood abruptly, body tense, eyes fixed on the window. Then he began pacing in a tight circle, his tail low, muscles rigid. At one point, he pressed his nose against the door and emitted a low, steady bark. Not aggressive, more like an alert. Ethan leaned closer, noticing the precision in the movement. The way Duke's ears tilted forward, the rhythm of his steps. It wasn't random fear, it was training. The next morning, he ran to his father's desk before school. "Dad, look at this." Mason rubbed his temples, half awake with his first cup of coffee. "What am I looking at?" Ethan showed him the video. "He's not just scared, he's remembering. Watch the way he moves, like he's guarding something." Mason frowned, watching the screen. "You're saying he's following command behavior?" "Exactly. It's like he's waiting for someone to give him an order." Mason studied the image of Duke on the laptop, the faint sound of the dog's bark echoing through the kitchen. He couldn't deny it. There was focus in that movement, a ghost of discipline that hadn't fully vanished. "Maybe," Mason said slowly. "Some things never really leave you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then we can help him remember." Mason looked at his son, the same determined expression that Mark used to wear during training sessions, and felt an unexpected pang of nostalgia. "All right," he said, closing his thermos lid, "but you're not doing this alone. I'll call Dr. Bennett." The name caught Ethan's curiosity. "Who's that?" "Veterinarian," Mason replied. "Used to handle all our canine medical checks. She's good." That afternoon, Dr. Claire Bennett arrived. She was in her early 40s, tall, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a winter coat that smelled faintly of antiseptic. A former Army vet who'd served as a field medic before opening her small clinic in town, Claire carried herself with quiet confidence. She knelt beside Duke, speaking softly as she examined him. "You're a handsome old boy," she murmured. "Seen better days, haven't you?" Ethan watched her carefully check Duke's heartbeat, joints, and scars. "Will he be okay?" he asked. Claire smiled faintly. "He's physically weak, but not broken. What he needs most is time and trust." She glanced at Mason. "You'll need to rebuild his confidence slowly. Avoid sudden sounds. Give him simple commands. Keep them consistent. Let him decide when to engage." Mason nodded. "He's been through hell. I guess we both have." Claire stood, brushing her hands off. Sometimes the ones who've seen too much just need someone who won't give up on them. She gave Ethan a gentle look. "Seems like Duke already found his someone." After she left, Ethan sat beside the dog again, reading softly from the old notebook. "Heel. Sit. Stay." The commands came awkwardly at first, but the rhythm was familiar. Duke's ears twitched. His eyes followed the boy's hand. When Ethan said, "Sit," the dog hesitated, then, slowly, obeyed. Ethan's eyes widened. "Good boy," he whispered, grinning. From the hallway, Mason paused, watching quietly. A small smile touched his lips. That night, after Ethan went to bed, he dreamt of a pale field, filled with soft, white light. Duke stood beside a tall man in a police uniform, Mark Davis, smiling down at him. His presence radiated calm. "Help him remember, Ethan," Mark said gently. "He once saved lives. Help him believe he can again." When Ethan woke, the dream still clung to him, warm and luminous like dawn. He ran to the mudroom. Duke lifted his head, and for the first time his tail wagged once. Ethan knelt and whispered, "Good morning, hero," and this time, Duke didn't look away. The days in Silver Ridge grew brighter but colder. Sunlight glimmered across the frozen fields, and icicles clung to the eaves of the Walker farmhouse like glass daggers. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove battled the winter chill, while a quiet rhythm had begun to settle between boy and dog, slow, cautious, and full of unspoken hope. Duke no longer hid in the corner. He followed Ethan Walker from room to room now, always keeping a respectful distance, as though afraid to cross a boundary. The boy spoke to him softly, read aloud from his father's old training manual, and rewarded the smallest progress with gentle praise. Sometimes, when Ethan's laughter filled the house, Mason would pause in his office doorway, half smiling before the weight of duty reminded him to look away. One Saturday morning, while Mason was out on patrol, Ethan decided to dig deeper into the pile of notebooks and folders his father kept in a wooden chest by the window. He remembered the dream. Mark Davis standing beside Duke in the glowing field of light, and the words that still echoed in his heart. Help him remember. The chest smelled faintly of old paper and gun oil. Inside were years of case notes, training guides, and a stack of photos from the old K-9 unit. Ethan sifted through them carefully, his fingers brushing over black and white snapshots of Mason and Mark, both younger, both smiling, Duke always between them. At the bottom of the chest, he found a small spiral notebook bound in cracked leather. Across the front in faded ink read, K-9 Operations Log, Davis and Duke. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, the notebook open in his lap. Inside were meticulous notes in Mark's handwriting, daily drills, commands, mission summaries. Some pages were stained with dirt and sweat, others with faint paw prints pressed into the corners. His eyes caught on a phrase repeated several times through the entries. Stay alert, Duke. Each mention had a small check mark beside it and a note underneath. Primary trigger phrase for readiness. Verbal command, tone firm, low. Ethan whispered the words aloud, testing them. Stay alert, Duke. The German shepherd, resting by the stove, stirred instantly. His ears perked up, muscles tensing. Slowly he rose to his feet, head high, eyes sharp. For the first time since the auction there was light. Clear, focused light in those amber eyes. Ethan's heart leapt. You remember that, don't you? He breathed. Stay alert, Duke. The dog stood taller, tail lifted slightly, his body perfectly still but alive with purpose. It was as if the words had reached into the fog of his mind and pulled out something that had never truly died. Ethan laughed, unable to help himself. "Dad, you need to see this." From the hall came the sound of boots on wood. Sheriff Mason Walker, just home from patrol, appeared in the doorway. He was still wearing his winter sheriff's coat, his face lined with fatigue. "What's going on?" "Watch," Ethan said breathlessly, turning toward the dog. "Stay alert, Duke." Mason froze as Duke's body snapped to attention again, the exact posture Mason remembered from years ago. Head up, chest forward, gaze steady. His breath caught. For a brief, impossible second, it was like seeing Mark again, standing in the training yard with Duke responding to every command like a soldier to his captain. "Jesus," Mason whispered. "He still remembers." Ethan nodded eagerly. "It's like a switch. He just woke up." Mason knelt slowly, his knees creaking against the old floorboards. "Hey, boy," he said softly. "You remember me?" Duke tilted his head, then stepped forward, closing the distance until his muzzle brushed Mason's hand. His tail wagged once, hesitant but sure. Mason swallowed hard. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice trembling despite himself. For a long while, neither man nor dog moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the soft breathing of the animal who had once saved lives. Ethan watched them in silence, sensing something sacred in the stillness, the reunion of two survivors bound by the memory of the same fallen friend. Mason finally stood and turned toward his office. "Ethan," he said quietly, "keep working with him. I need to check something." When he entered the office, the warmth of the stove faded, replaced by the sterile scent of paper and dust. The sheriff's desk was cluttered with unfinished reports and cold coffee, but one drawer remained locked, the one Mason hadn't opened since Mark's death. He hesitated, fingers brushing the brass handle, then sighed and unlocked it. Inside lay a thin file marked Case Number 412, the Donovan operation. He hadn't looked at those pages in 3 years. The words were burned into his memory anyway. Weapons trafficking, smuggling route, explosive devices. The night Mark died, they had been following a lead on Earl Donovan, a notorious arms dealer who'd vanished after the explosion. The case had been closed when the evidence burned in the blast. Presumed deceased, the report had said. But as Mason flipped through the faded photos and field notes, one document caught his eye. An unsigned tip report, dated just a week before the explosion. The handwriting was messy but familiar. It was Mark's. The note read, "Shipment moved earlier than expected. Possible mole in local enforcement. Need to verify." Mason's pulse quickened. He scanned the page again, the unease spreading through him like cold water. A mole. A betrayal. That part had never been mentioned in the final investigation. He pulled another file from the cabinet, cross-referencing arrest records. Donovan's name wasn't listed anywhere after that night. It was as if he'd disappeared off the face of the earth. Outside the office, Ethan's laughter echoed faintly, and the sound of a shined boy rediscovering hope through a wounded animal. Mason closed the file slowly and stared at the old photograph on the wall. Him, Mark, and Duke, side by side. "Maybe you didn't die for nothing, Mark," he whispered. "Maybe there's still something left to finish." That night, while Ethan and Duke rested near the fire, Mason sat at his desk with the case file spread open in front of him. The lamplight flickered over the words, casting long shadows across the paper. In the quiet, he could almost hear Mark's voice again. Calm, steady, reassuring. "Stay alert, Mason." He looked up toward the window, where Duke lay curled up beside Ethan, finally asleep without trembling. Mason took a deep breath. "All right, partner," he murmured. "Looks like we've both got ghosts to wake." The night was quiet over Silver Ridge, the kind of deep silence that follows snowfall. Heavy, muffled, and endless. The moon hung pale above the fields, and inside the Walker farmhouse, the firelight flickered over the wooden floor. Sheriff Mason Walker sat in his armchair, still in uniform, his badge glinting faintly in the glow. Across from him, Ethan and Duke rested together on the rug, the boy with a blanket around his shoulders, the dog's head resting gently on his lap. Mason had been silent for a long time, eyes fixed on the flames. Ethan knew that look. His father was wrestling with memories he rarely shared. The boy finally spoke, voice soft. "Dad, what really happened to Uncle Mark?" Mason looked up slowly. The question had been coming for years, but he'd never found the strength to answer it fully. Not to his son, not even to himself. He took a long breath, leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "It was the winter of 2019, he began. "Your Uncle Mark and I were working a joint task force with the federal unit. We were closing in on a man named Earl Donovan, a weapons smuggler who'd been moving stolen explosives through the freight warehouses east of town." His eyes narrowed slightly, the firelight catching the lines of age and exhaustion etched around them. "We had good intel, or at least we thought we did." He paused, gaze distant. "We went in late that night. The power had been cut, snow coming down hard. Duke was leading the team. Best K9 I'd ever worked beside. He detected traces of ammonium nitrate along the west wall. That should have been our warning." Ethan leaned closer, listening intently, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Mark went in first," Mason continued. "He always did. Said it was part of the job. You can't lead from behind." "I was 10 feet away when the explosion hit. 1 second, Duke barked, sharp, like he'd seen something, and the next, the world went white." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I woke up outside, half buried in snow and debris. Mark was gone, and Duke—" His voice faltered. "He wasn't there either." For a moment, only the crackle of fire filled the silence. Ethan's eyes shimmered with tears. "You thought he died, didn't you?" Mason nodded. "We searched for weeks. All we found were fragments. The scorched remains of Mark's badge, pieces of the truck, but no trace of Duke. The investigation said the blast came from a fuel leak, but I never believed that. There was diesel residue everywhere, far too much for just a vehicle fire." At the mention of diesel, Duke stirred. His ears twitched, head lifting slightly. Mason noticed and frowned. "You see that? He remembers." The dog's breathing quickened. A low whimper escaped his throat. Ethan immediately laid a hand on his neck. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe here." Mason watched closely, his lawman's instincts sparking. He's reacting to the word, or maybe the memory. He stood slowly. "PTSD, it's the same in people. Certain triggers pull them right back into the worst moment of their lives." Ethan swallowed. "Can we help him?" Mason's expression softened. "We can try, but it'll take patience, and a lot of heart." Over the following days, Ethan read everything he could about canine trauma. His bedroom became a mix of school books and old training manuals. He even borrowed one from Dr. Claire Bennett, who stopped by with more advice and a small sound therapy kit, a set of recorded noises used for exposure recovery. "Start with quiet," she said gently. "Then raise the volume slowly. Make sure he feels safe." Claire's calm professionalism never lost its warmth. She stood tall in her winter coat, her sandy brown hair tied back in a bun, her eyes kind but knowing. "He's been through a soldier's hell," she told Mason, "but I've seen dogs recover from worse, as long as someone believes they can." That night, after Mason left for the precinct, Ethan decided to begin. He sat cross-legged on the living room rug beside Duke, the sound kit set up on his tablet. The first file was a faint crackle. Distant fireworks, muffled. The moment it played, Duke flinched but didn't move away. "It's okay," Ethan said softly. "It's not real. Just a sound." He placed a hand gently on the dog's back, feeling the tremor ripple through him. "I'm right here." Minutes passed. The recording looped quietly, a little louder each time. Ethan kept his voice steady, his presence constant. Slowly, Duke's trembling eased. The dog's head lowered, resting against Ethan's knee. "That's it," the boy whispered. "Good boy." The next few nights followed the same ritual. Each time, Ethan increased the sound slightly. The pop of fireworks, the faint boom of thunder. At first, Duke would shake and whine, but with each session, his reaction grew milder. Ethan noted everything in a small notebook labeled Operation Braveheart. One evening, as the sound played, Duke suddenly rose and began pacing the room, his head lifted, nostrils flaring. He moved toward the door, muscles tense. Ethan reached for the remote, ready to stop the audio, but then Duke froze beside the old sheriff's coat hanging on the rack. His nose pressed against it, sniffing intently. A faint smell of diesel oil clung to the fabric, remnants from Mason's patrol vehicle. The reaction was immediate. Duke's eyes widened. He barked sharply, retreating a step. His tail dropped, hackles raised. It wasn't fear this time. It was recognition. Ethan's heart pounded. "What is it, boy?" Duke let out a low growl, then circled the coat again, barking twice, short and deliberate. The same alert pattern Mason had described from their old canine operations. When Mason came home that evening, Ethan told him everything. He reacted to Diesel, Dad, like he remembered something. Mason stared at the coat, then at the dog. Diesel was everywhere that night, he said slowly. The blast site reeked of it. Ethan frowned. You think it means something? I don't know, Mason admitted, rubbing his chin. But if Duke's memory is tied to that smell, maybe he remembers more than we think. He glanced at his son, a flicker of pride crossing his face. You're doing good work, Ethan. Keep going. That night, long after Ethan had gone to bed, Mason stood by the window, the cold moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. He looked down at the case file on his desk, the words, Earl Donovan, missing, printed across the top. Behind him, Duke lay sleeping beside the fire. His paws twitched, tail flicking. Mason watched, realizing the dog was dreaming, perhaps reliving those same chaotic moments from years ago. You still remember, don't you? Mason whispered. Maybe it's time I start remembering too. As the wind rattled the windows, he opened the old folder once again. A smell of paper and ash filled the room. Somewhere deep inside, the ghosts of that night were stirring, and this time, they wouldn't stay buried. The wind screamed through Silver Ridge that night, carrying shards of snow that cut through the dark like tiny knives. The town's street lamps flickered under the weight of the storm, and the pines beyond the edge of the property bent low under their burden of ice. Inside the farmhouse, the fire burned low, its glow reflecting off the window where Ethan Walker sat, notebook open, watching Duke. The German shepherd had been restless all evening. His ears twitched at sounds beyond the house, a branch snapping, the distant hum of the wind. Then suddenly he stood up, muscles tense, tail stiff. His amber eyes locked on the window. What is it, boy? Ethan whispered, setting his notebook down. Duke moved to the door, pawing at it, whining softly. Ethan hesitated. It's freezing out there. But the dog's insistence grew stronger, not frantic, but determined. He barked once, short and sharp, the kind of bark that meant, follow me. Ethan glanced toward the hallway where his father's office light glowed faintly under the door. Mason had fallen asleep at his desk again, the case files spread open like ghosts on paper. The boy quietly slipped on his boots, grabbed his flashlight, and pulled on his thick coat. All right, he said, voice trembling with excitement and a bit of fear. Lead the way, Duke. They stepped out into the snow. The cold bit at his face, and the world seemed to shrink to the narrow cone of light cast by the flashlight. Duke moved ahead, sure-footed despite the drifts, heading toward the tree line behind the property. That part of the woods had been sealed off for years. Locals still called it the Ridge Cut, the site of the explosion that took Mark Davis's life. Warning signs still hung on the chain-link fence that bordered the area, half buried in frost and age. Restricted area. Do not enter. But Duke didn't stop. He pushed through a gap in the wire where time and weather had bent it loose. Ethan followed, his breath catching as he stepped into the silence beyond the fence. Even the wind seemed to fade inside those trees. The snow here was deeper, untouched. The flashlight beam swept across twisted metal half buried in the drifts, remnants of the destroyed warehouse. Duke sniffed the air, nose close to the ground, tracing an invisible path. His steps grew faster, his body language alert and focused. Duke, wait! Ethan called, stumbling after him. The dog stopped suddenly near the edge of a small clearing. The ground was uneven there, where debris still lay scattered from the explosion years ago. Duke began to dig, paws throwing snow aside until his claws scraped metal. Ethan crouched beside him and brushed the snow away with his gloved hands. A license plate, blackened and bent, emerged from the frozen dirt. The last few numbers were barely legible, but the letters COU 47 remained visible through the soot. Ethan's heart pounded. Dad needs to see this. Before he could grab the plate, Duke's ears twitched. He turned sharply toward the trees, growling low. Ethan followed his gaze but saw only darkness and blowing snow. Then, faintly, the beam of the flashlight glinted off something. A spent shell casing, half buried in the snow. Ethan picked it up carefully. It was brass, old but not rusted, the kind used in police-issue rifles. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. This can't still be here after 3 years, he whispered. Duke barked once, short and commanding, as if confirming what Ethan already suspected. This wasn't just old wreckage. Someone had been here recently. They returned to the farmhouse with their finds wrapped in a cloth. The wind had grown fiercer, and by the time they reached the porch, snow clung to their coats in thick patches. Ethan burst through the door, startling Mason awake. "Dad, you have to see this," he said, breathless. Mason rubbed his eyes, weary. "Ethan, what?" "From the forest. Duke found it." Ethan placed the license plate and bullet casing on the table, snow still melting off them. Mason's fatigue vanished instantly. He grabbed his reading glasses, examining the evidence under the desk lamp. His expression darkened. "This plate's from a delivery truck, same model used in the Donovan case. And this casing." He turned it in his hand. .308 caliber. Standard issue for enforcement rifles, but this one's different. Look here. No oxidation, no corrosion. It hasn't been sitting out for 3 years. This is recent. He looked up sharply. "Ethan, when did you find this?" "Just now. Duke took me there. He knew exactly where to go." Mason leaned back slowly, exhaling. He's remembering again. He picked up the plate, rubbing his thumb over the burned numbers. "We wrote this case off as an accident, but if there's live evidence out there, that means someone's been back, maybe cleaning up." Ethan frowned. "Cleaning up what?" "The past," Mason said quietly. "Or what's left of it." He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the storm had thickened, snow swirling like ghosts in the pale light. Duke sat by the door now, ears pricked, staring out into the darkness. Then, without warning, he barked, once, twice, facing the mountains beyond town. The sound cut through the storm like a signal flare. Mason froze. "He's pointing," he murmured, just like he used to during searches. Ethan followed his father's gaze toward the distant ridge, barely visible beyond the curtain of snow. "What's out there?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Nothing but old mining roads and frozen trails." He paused. "And if I'm right, maybe the last piece of what killed Mark." He turned back to his son. "You did good, Ethan. But you don't go back there without me. Promise me that." "I promise," Ethan said, though his heart still raced from the thrill of discovery. Mason nodded, then crouched beside Duke, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he said softly. "You remember what we couldn't." Duke leaned into the touch, eyes fixed on the window, tail thumping once against the floor. Outside, the storm began to shift, the wind easing, the snow slowing. It felt as if something in the air had changed, like a warning whispered through the cold. Later that night, Mason reopened the Donovan file again, the evidence laid out beside it. The number COU 47 burned in his mind. He began matching it to transport logs from the old investigation. And there it was, listed under a front company, Coulter Freight, the same trucking line tied to Donovan's smuggling routes. He sat back slowly, realization dawning. "You didn't die by accident, Mark," he whispered. "Someone made sure of it." Outside, Duke lifted his head, ears flicking as if he'd heard the words. He rose, walked to the door, and barked once more into the storm, toward the mountains where the wind seemed to carry voices from the past. And Mason, listening to that sound, felt it too. The sense that the case, long thought buried, was stirring again beneath the snow. Snow was still falling when the call came in. Sheriff Mason Walker had just returned from the precinct, his coat still dusted white from the storm, when his phone buzzed violently on the kitchen counter. The ringtone cut through the quiet, making Duke lift his head from beside the fire. "Walker here," Mason answered, his voice instinctively sharpening. On the other end came the breathless tone of Deputy Cole Reeves, a man in his early 30s with short sandy hair, rugged build, and a reputation for being steady under pressure. "Sheriff, you need to get down here. The old Ridge warehouse, the one sealed after the Donovan explosion, it's on fire again." Mason froze. "That site's been closed for 3 years." "I know, sir, but we've got flames 20 feet high and—" Static crackled through the radio, and I thought I saw movement inside before it blew. Mason's pulse spiked. He grabbed his keys, shouting toward the living room. "Ethan, stay here! Lock the doors!" Duke was already on his feet, tail rigid, eyes locked on the door. Mason hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "All right, boy, let's go." The drive to the outskirts of town took less than 10 minutes. The glow of the fire was visible even before they reached the clearing. Orange light licked at the falling snow, turning the night into a surreal blaze of color. Fire engines and patrol cars surrounded the site, their sirens muffled by the wind. Deputy Cole was at the perimeter, his face flushed with cold and exertion. His heavy brown jacket was singed at the sleeve, his breath forming plumes in the freezing air. "It started inside," he shouted over the roar of the blaze. "No power line, no lightning. Looks deliberate." Mason's jaw tightened. "Any injuries?" "None so far, but—" Cole gestured toward the collapsing structure. "We heard shouting before the roof came down. Someone's still in there." Without hesitation, Duke barked and lunged forward. Mason grabbed his harness. "Easy, boy. We need backup first." But Duke growled low, muscles quivering with urgency. His eyes fixed on the flames as if something inside was calling to him. "Sheriff, we can't get close," a firefighter yelled, running over. A tall man in his 40s named Captain Harris, broad-shouldered and soot-streaked. "It's too unstable." Mason looked at Duke, then back at the inferno. The heat was intense, waves of it pressing against his face. "That's not a normal fire," he muttered. "Someone wanted to erase something." A sudden crash echoed from within, a wall collapsing. Cole turned sharply. "Wait!" His radio crackled. "Unit 3, we've got movement inside, northwest corridor." Cole didn't wait. "I'm going in." "Cole, no!" Mason yelled, but the deputy was already sprinting into the blaze, coat pulled over his mouth. "Damn it!" Mason looked down at Duke, whose ears flattened in anticipation. "All right, boy, find him." The shepherd took off through the snow and smoke, disappearing into the shadows of the ruined building. Mason followed, keeping low as embers rained down. Inside, the air was suffocating. Heat, smoke, and twisted metal everywhere. "Cole!" Mason shouted. "Answer me!" A faint cough responded from somewhere deeper inside. Duke darted toward the sound, navigating the maze of debris with uncanny precision. He stopped near a collapsed beam, barking furiously. Beneath it, Mason saw a flash of brown, Cole's jacket. "I've got him!" Mason yelled. The beam was too heavy to lift alone. Mason tried anyway, teeth gritted, muscles straining. Duke bit onto the sleeve of Cole's coat, tugging, refusing to stop, even as sparks showered around them. Together, they managed to pull him free just as another section of the roof gave way. "Move!" Mason shouted, grabbing Cole by the arm. Duke led the way, his bark cutting through the chaos, guiding them through a narrow gap that had been blasted open near the north wall. They stumbled out into the snow, gasping for air as firefighters rushed to meet them. Cole collapsed onto the ground, coughing, but alive. Mason dropped to one knee beside him. "You all right, Deputy?" Cole nodded weakly. "I think so. That dog of yours, he's something else." Mason turned to Duke, who stood a few feet away, smoke curling from his fur. His front leg was bleeding where a piece of debris had grazed him, but his posture was steady, proud, unyielding. The look in his eyes wasn't pain, it was purpose. "Good boy," Mason whispered, pressing a hand to the dog's shoulder. "You did it again." By dawn, the fire was finally out. What remained of the warehouse was nothing but ash and twisted beams. The air still smelled of burnt chemicals and diesel, that same familiar stench from 3 years ago. Mason stood beside the wreckage, exhaustion etched deep in his face. Cole, arm bandaged, joined him with a grim expression. "You think it's connected?" Cole asked quietly. "I think someone doesn't want us asking questions," Mason replied, but they made a mistake coming back. One of the fire marshals approached, a young woman with soot on her cheeks. "Sheriff, we found something in the debris. You might want to see this." She handed him a scorched hard drive sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Security footage?" "Looks like it. Found near the office wing. Somehow didn't melt completely." Back at the precinct later that morning, Mason connected the damaged drive to the department's recovery terminal. The footage was grainy, glitching from heat damage, but parts were still visible. He fast-forwarded through static until movement flickered on the screen. A figure, dressed in dark winter clothing, entering the warehouse before the explosion. The man's face turned briefly toward the Shouty. Camera, illuminated by firelight. Earl Donovan. Even through the distortion, Mason recognized him instantly. The same sharp jawline, the cold, calculating stare. "He's alive," Mason muttered, almost disbelieving. Cole leaned forward, his eyes widening. "That's him? The guy from the old case?" Mason nodded slowly. "He's back, and he's covering his tracks." They watched in silence as the footage showed Donovan setting down a black duffel bag, pulling out a small device, a timer. A moment later, the screen cut to static as the blast consumed the frame. Mason sat back, the weight of realization settling over him. This wasn't just arson. He's destroying evidence, maybe even preparing for something bigger. Duke, lying near Mason's desk with his leg bandaged, lifted his head. His eyes caught the flickering image on the monitor, and he let out a low growl, deep and deliberate. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Mason reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You still remember him, don't you?" Duke's ears twitched, his gaze unwavering. The flame of his old training burned bright again, tempered by time, but not extinguished. He was no longer the broken creature found at the auction. In his eyes now glowed the same courage that once made him a hero. Mason turned back to Cole, his voice steady. "We reopen the case. No more silence." Cole nodded grimly. "What about Duke?" Mason smiled faintly. "He's already back on duty." Outside the window, dawn broke over Silver Ridge. Pale gold light spilling across the snow-covered town. Smoke from the warehouse still rose in the distance, a dark pillar against the morning sky. But in the sheriff's office, there was something stronger than smoke or shadow. The quiet resurgence of justice, carried in the eyes of a dog who refused to forget. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Silver Ridge wrapped in a still, pale silence. Morning sunlight glimmered weakly through thin clouds, scattering across the frost-covered pines. At the Walker farmhouse, Ethan sat hunched over the kitchen table, the license plate he and Duke had found still wrapped in a piece of old flannel beside him. His friend, Lucas Carter, a freckled boy of 12 with a mop of unruly blonde hair and an oversized red parka, leaned over the plate with curiosity. Lucas was the son of a local mechanic, smart, restless, always tinkering with broken gadgets in his father's shop. His round glasses slipped down his nose as he squinted at the metal. "You're sure this came from the explosion site?" he whispered. Ethan nodded, his tone serious. "Duke found it buried under the snow. Dad thinks it was part of Donovan's truck. I want to know if it's still registered somewhere." Lucas grinned, a spark of mischief lighting his eyes. "So, you want to hack the DMV?" Ethan frowned. "Not hack, just check. Dad has access through his precinct account. If we can find the number." Lucas chuckled. "You do realize you just said that out loud?" Ethan sighed. "Fine. Maybe we use the public record database. It's legal enough?" The boys set to work in the living room, Duke lying nearby with his injured paw bandaged, occasionally raising his head to watch them. The laptop's glow reflected off Ethan's determined face as Lucas typed rapidly, navigating between state registration archives and transport records. After half an hour, Lucas whistled. "Got something. COU 47. Last registered to Coulter Freight, decommissioned 3 years ago after the explosion. But look here." He scrolled further. "The plate was reissued last month to a new company called Iron Creek Logistics, based 2 towns over in Red Hollow." Ethan's heart skipped. "Iron Creek? That's the same route Donovan used to smuggle explosives." Lucas looked uncertain. "You think it's the same guy?" Ethan turned toward Duke, whose ears had perked up at the name. "He knows it too," the boy murmured. At that moment, the dog rose and limped toward the window, staring out at the snow-covered road. His body tensed. Alert. Focused. Ethan felt a shiver run through him. "He wants to go," he said quietly. Lucas blinked. "Go where?" Ethan zipped up his coat, grabbed his father's old camera, and slung it over his shoulder. "To find Iron Creek." Lucas groaned. "Your dad's gonna kill you." Ethan gave a nervous grin. "Probably. But Mark used to take Duke to follow leads when no one else believed him. Maybe we'll find something before Dad does." Within minutes, the 2 boys were trudging down the icy road, Duke leading the way with surprising energy for a dog still recovering. The path curved along the riverbank and eventually reached the outskirts of town, where old warehouses sat, abandoned under drifts of snow. They reached an old truck stop first. Rusted fuel pumps, shattered windows, and a faded sign that read, Iron Creek Depot. Lucas squinted. "I think we found it." Ethan raised his camera and began filming the area, the steady crunch of their boots echoing across the empty lot. "We'll show Dad," he said. "If this place is active again, it means Donovan's crew never left." Duke sniffed the ground near a row of tire tracks partially buried in snow. He followed the trail to a corrugated metal door that looked recently forced open. The scent of diesel was strong, and Duke's tail went rigid. "Something's inside," Ethan whispered. Lucas's face paled. "Maybe we should—" Before he could finish, a faint sound came from within, the rumble of machinery, then the metallic clang of a closing latch. Duke growled low, teeth bared. Ethan's instincts kicked in. "Come on, back up." Quietly. They ducked behind a snow-covered crate as a figure emerged from the warehouse. A man in a dark parka, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a metal clipboard. His breath formed clouds in the air as he spoke into a walkie-talkie. Ethan held his breath, focusing the camera just enough to catch the logo stitched on the man's sleeve. Iron Creek Logistics. And beneath it, a faint marking shaped like a hawk's talon. Lucas whispered, "We got proof. We gotta go now." They retreated the way they came, hearts pounding until they reached the road. Only when the warehouse was far behind did Ethan stop, catching his breath. "We need to show this to Dad." By the time they reached the farmhouse, dusk had fallen, and Mason's patrol truck was already parked out front. The sheriff stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes dark with worry. "Ethan, Lucas, inside, now." The tone left no room for argument. Inside, Mason closed the door behind them. "Do either of you realize how dangerous that was? That area's under surveillance for a reason." Ethan's voice trembled. "We weren't trying to cause trouble. Duke led us there. We found something." He handed Mason the camera. Mason plugged it into his laptop, fast-forwarding through shaky footage until the frame froze on the man outside the warehouse. The Iron Creek patch clearly visible. Mason's expression shifted from anger to realization. "You found their base." Lucas couldn't help but grin. "Guess we're junior detectives now?" Mason shot him a look, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're lucky you didn't get caught, but you did good." He turned to his son, voice softening. "Ethan, this was reckless, but you followed your instincts, and you trusted Duke. That's exactly what Mark would have done." Ethan looked down, guilt and pride warring in his eyes. "I just wanted to help." Mason crouched, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did. Because of this, we can finally move forward. Tomorrow, we bring a team to Iron Creek." Duke, lying beside them, lifted his head at the sound of his name, eyes gleaming with a quiet determination. His paw still bore a bandage, but his spirit was unbroken, the look of a soldier who refused to stay down. Mason reached down, giving the shepherd's neck a firm pat. "Seems your partner's teaching my son better than I am." Ethan smiled through the fatigue. "He's not just remembering, Dad. He's leading us back." Mason chuckled softly. "Then I guess it's time we followed." The fire crackled gently as snow began to fall again outside, blanketing the porch in white. For the first time in years, the Walker home felt alive, not just with hope, but with purpose. And as Duke lay beside the hearth, his gaze fixed on the window, it was as if he could already see the road ahead, the unfinished mission waiting beyond the ridge. The blizzard rolled over Red Hollow like a white beast, swallowing sound and light. Snow whipped through the night in violent spirals, coating everything in ice and shadow. The old Iron Creek Logistics warehouse stood on the edge of town, its steel walls trembling under the wind. The storm made visibility almost zero, a perfect cover for men who wanted to disappear. Through the chaos, the flashing lights of police SUVs cut through the whiteout. Engines idled low, radios crackled, and armed officers took positions behind snow-dusted barriers. Inside the lead vehicle, Sheriff Mason Walker watched the dim shape of the warehouse ahead, his jaw tight, his breath fogging the window. Across from him sat Lieutenant Sarah Briggs, commander of the county SWAT unit, a seasoned officer in her early 40s, with short auburn hair tucked under a black tactical cap and eyes sharp as flint. Her calm, clipped voice broke the silence. "Thermal scans show movement inside. 3, maybe 4 figures. One of them matches Donovan's build." Mason nodded. "We'll take him alive if we can." Sarah smirked faintly. "If he gives us the chance." In the back seat, Duke waited, muscles coiled under his vest. His bandaged paw had healed enough for movement, though Mason still worried. The shepherd's eyes glowed amber in the dim light, focused and steady. Mason leaned closer, resting a hand on his partner's head. "You ready for this, boy?" Duke's tail gave one slow wag, silent acknowledgement. The wind roared as Mason stepped out of the truck. Snow slapped his face, biting into his skin, but his focus stayed razor-sharp. "Positions!" he barked. The SWAT team fanned out, shadows moving through snow, their weapons gleaming under the blue of the flashlights. Through the earpiece, Sarah's voice came steady. "North flank in position. On your go, Sheriff." Mason raised his hand, signaled. The sound of boots crunched on snow as they advanced. The warehouse loomed closer. Its entrance half collapsed, one light flickering over the door like a dying heartbeat. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the storm. A bullet ricocheted off a police shield, spraying sparks. "Contact!" Sarah shouted. "Return fire!" Chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes lit the snow like lightning. Mason ducked behind a snowbank, scanning through the smoke and wind. He spotted movement. A tall man darting between crates near the loading bay. The glint of a rifle barrel caught his eye. "Donovan!" Mason shouted. Another shot whizzed past him, grazing his sleeve. The storm made it impossible to see clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Earl Donovan, his parka flapping in the gale, face half hidden behind a scarf. The smuggler had aged, mid-40s now, broad-shouldered, with cold, feral eyes that gleamed with hate. "You should have stayed out of this, Walker." Donovan's voice carried through the storm. "You already lost one." "Partner, because of me!" Rage flared through Mason. "You murdered him," he growled, rising from cover. Donovan fired again, forcing Mason back behind the SUV. The man laughed, a wild, echoing sound that cut through the wind. "And now, I'll finish what I started." "Stay down!" Sarah barked through the comms. But Mason had already moved. He sprinted toward the side of the warehouse, snow crunching beneath his boots. Duke followed at his heel, perfectly in sync. The storm thickened. Flakes slashed across their vision. Somewhere behind the warehouse, an explosion ripped through a storage tank, lighting up the night with orange flame. "Back up! Move in!" Sarah's voice ordered. "Fire in Sector 3!" Mason turned the corner. And there he was. Donovan stood by a truck, fumbling with a detonator, his breath heavy in the frigid air. "Drop it!" Mason yelled. Donovan turned, sneering. "You really think you'll take me alive?" He raised his gun. Mason fired first. The bullet grazing Donovan's shoulder, spinning him sideways. The criminal stumbled, but didn't fall. He turned his weapon again, this time directly at Mason. And then came the command that echoed from Mason's throat before he even realized he'd said it. "Stay alert, Duke!" The shepherd exploded forward, a blur of black and tan against the snow. He leapt through the smoke, hitting Donovan square in the chest just as the gun fired. The two went down hard, the shot ringing into the sky. "Duke!" Mason shouted, rushing toward them. The dog clamped his jaws on Donovan's arm, wrenching the gun free. The man screamed, struggling, kicking, but Duke held firm. His teeth were locked with every ounce of his strength, not in fury, but in duty. "Get off me, you damned mutt!" Donovan snarled, slamming a knee into Duke's ribs. The shepherd yelped but didn't let go. Blood darkened the snow beneath them. Mason reached them, grabbing Donovan by the collar and slamming him against the truck. "You're done!" he roared, wrenching the cuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, and the death of Officer Mark Davis." Donovan spat blood, grinning through the pain. "You're too late. You can't stop what's coming." Mason shoved him into the snow and locked the cuffs tight. "We'll see about that." Only then did he turn to Duke, and his breath caught. The dog lay on his side, chest rising unevenly, a dark stain spreading beneath his vest. His eyes were still open, bright but fading, fixed on Mason. "Duke!" Mason dropped to his knees, pulling the shepherd into his arms. Snowflakes clung to his coat, melting against the warmth of blood. "Stay with me, boy. Stay with me." Duke's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. He tried to lift his head, but couldn't. Mason pressed a hand to the wound, his other trembling against the dog's neck. "Medical team!" he shouted, hoarsely into the radio. "We need a medic at the northwest sector now." Sarah's voice crackled back. "Copy that. En route." Mason looked down again. The dog's eyes flicked toward the handcuffed Donovan lying in the snow, as if to make sure the job was done. Then he looked back at Mason, a faint exhale leaving his muzzle, soft and steady. Mason's throat tightened. "You did it, partner," he whispered. "You finished it." He bowed his head, tears freezing as they hit the snow. "You've earned your rest, my friend." The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of smoke and iron. Behind him, officers dragged Donovan toward the waiting convoy, his shouts swallowed by the storm. Mason stayed where he was, holding Duke close, his breath ragged. The storm no longer felt cold. It felt hollow, heavy with the weight of loss and love. Sarah approached quietly, her eyes somber. She placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "We'll get him to the vet clinic in Ridge Point," she said softly. "There's still a chance." Mason nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving the dog's face. "He's not just a dog," he whispered. "He's my partner." As the medics lifted Duke onto a stretcher, the storm began to break. The wind slowed, and a faint light glimmered in the distance. The first hint of dawn over the ridge. Mason followed beside the stretcher, one hand resting on Duke's paw the entire way. And though blood stained the snow behind them, there was a strange peace in that moment. The storm had passed, and with it, justice had finally caught up to the ghost that had haunted them all. The winter sun rose slowly over Silver Ridge, soft light spilling across the mountains like a benediction. The storm had long passed, leaving the world hushed under a pristine blanket of snow. For the first time in weeks, the town seemed to breathe again, calm, peaceful, as if the land itself had been washed clean of sorrow. Inside the Silver Ridge Veterinary Clinic, a faint whine broke the silence of the recovery room. Duke stirred on his cot, bandaged but alive, one ear twitching as light touched his muzzle. The scars along his side had begun to heal. The once weak breathing was now steady. When the door opened, he lifted his head, and his tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Sheriff Mason Walker stepped inside, his uniform pressed, but his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He had barely slept since that night. A small smile flickered across his face when he saw the shepherd awake. "Well, look who's back from the fight," he murmured. Behind him followed Dr. Claire Bennett, still in her white coat, her stethoscope slung loosely around her neck. "He's tougher than any patient I've had in years," she said, smiling faintly. "You'd think he'd run a marathon instead of taking a bullet." Mason chuckled softly. "That's Duke for you, too stubborn to quit." He knelt beside the cot, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You saved my life again, partner. Guess I owe you another steak dinner." Duke pressed his nose against Mason's hand, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. The sight drew a tear Mason didn't bother to hide. From the hallway came hurried footsteps and a boy's voice calling, "Dad, is he awake?" Ethan burst through the door, still wearing his thick school jacket and mismatched mittens. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his eyes shone with relief. "Duke!" he gasped, running forward. The shepherd wagged his tail harder, letting out a soft bark. "Easy, buddy," Mason said with a chuckle. "He's still healing." Ethan crouched beside him anyway, careful, but close enough to feel the warmth of the dog's fur. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought him back." Mason exchanged a look with Claire, who smiled knowingly. "If this isn't a miracle," she said, "I don't know what is." 2 weeks later, the town gathered in Silver Ridge Square for a ceremony that felt both solemn and full of light. Snow drifted gently from a pale blue sky as townsfolk, officers, and families stood in a circle around a new bronze statue. Officer Mark Davis and Duke, immortalized side by side in their uniforms. A cold wind tugged at Mason's coat as he stood at the podium, the sheriff's badge glinting on his chest. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. 3 years ago, this town lost a hero. Officer Mark Davis gave his life protecting us from the kind of darkness most people never see. We thought his story ended that night, but thanks to Duke, and thanks to my son Ethan, we know now that courage never dies. It only waits for someone to carry it forward. He paused, scanning the crowd. Ethan stood front and center, Duke sitting proudly beside him, wearing a new polished harness and a silver canine tag engraved with the words, "For Mark, for Ethan, for the ones we protect." The audience applauded softly. Even the most hardened officers in the crowd had to blink away tears. Mason continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, we honor Mark Davis posthumously with the Medal of Valor, and we welcome Duke back into service officially as part of the Silver Ridge K-9 unit." Applause rose again, louder this time. Duke barked once, chest high, as if understanding every word. The sound carried over the square, bright and fierce like a salute. When the ceremony ended, the townspeople drifted toward the statue, leaving flowers, badges, and folded notes at its base. Mason stood for a moment beside the monument, his hand resting on the cold bronze shoulder of his fallen friend. "You can rest easy now, Mark," he said softly. "Your boy's watching over us again." He turned to find Ethan standing nearby, snowflakes caught in his hair. "So," Mason said with a smile, "what do you think, Assistant Trainer Walker?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Assistant Trainer?" Mason nodded. "That's what the department decided. Someone's got to help keep Duke sharp." Ethan's grin could have outshone the sun. "Yes, sir!" Claire, standing a few feet away, laughed warmly. "You two make quite the team," she said. "Silver Ridge will sleep well with these two around." As the crowd dispersed, Mason and Ethan walked toward the edge of the square, Duke trotting between them. The snow had thickened again, soft flakes spiraling through the air like feathers. The light of dusk painted everything gold. Ethan bent down, scooping a handful of snow, and with a mischievous grin, tossed it gently toward Duke. The shepherd barked and leapt after it, catching the snowball mid-air before landing gracefully. The sound of Ethan's laughter echoed through the cold air, pure and bright. "Guess you still got it," Mason said, watching the dog shake snow from his fur. Ethan turned to his father, smiling. "You think Mark can see us?" Mason looked toward the horizon where the mountains glowed beneath the last light of day. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he's been watching this whole time." As the wind swept across the square, the statue of Mark and Duke gleamed faintly in the twilight, and for a fleeting moment it almost seemed as if the bronze dog had turned its head toward the living one below. Duke barked once, deep and sure, then sat proudly beside Ethan, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The world around them shimmered with light, a promise, a memory, and a future all at once. The storm was long over, and in its place, beneath the golden dawn, stood a boy, a father, and a dog, bound forever by courage, loyalty, and love. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive in flashes of light or thunder from heaven. They come quietly, through loyalty, love, and second chances. Duke's return was more than the story of a dog finding his purpose again. It was a reminder that God often works through the small acts of courage that live within us. When we reach out to help, when we choose compassion over fear, we become the instruments of His grace. Just like Mason, Ethan, and Duke, we all face moments that test our faith, times when the storm feels endless and hope seems buried under the snow. But faith, even in its smallest form, can bring healing where logic sees none. And sometimes God sends us angels not with wings, but with fur, loyalty, and a heartbeat that reminds us we're never truly alone. So, as you finish this story, take a moment to thank God for the loyal souls, human or animal, who walk beside you. May this tale remind you that love redeems, faith restores, and kindness never goes unseen by heaven. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and type Amen if you believe that God still performs miracles through love and loyalty. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, courage, and faith in every season of life. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate God's quiet miracles. Amen.